Welcome to this first of several videos on research design tasks. I think of all the videos in this series, you'll find this is one of the most useful hands-on sessions. I'm going to talk about several different tasks of research design, and we'll use in between the different videos in this series some exercises. And we're going to use for those exercises a running example of how we might carry out research on the politics and economics and sociology of the COVID pandemic, and both the effects of the pandemic and the responses to it by governments, organizations, businesses, employees, employers, and so on and so forth. So I like to start off with this image, which is one of the most famous infographics in history. This is by Louis Menard, and it shows graphically a depiction of Napoleon's march to Moscow and back from Moscow in his military campaign of 1812 to 1813. The tan squiggles represent the number of troops that Napoleon had. So the wider that band is, the more troops he had. You can see the troops diminishing over time as it goes from France on the left to Moscow on the right. So it shows the geography a little bit. And then the dark band coming back, which is much narrower, is the number of troops he had coming back from Moscow. And you can see those diminish until there's almost no troops left in his effective fighting force. It also shows different causal variables here, battles, geography, the weather. It shows the temperature. This is a very cold winter in Russia. And so here you can see sort of visually a kind of a case where you could do a case study and make causal inference on the question of why did Napoleon lose. So it's a very nice visual depiction of a case that's very interesting. So for this session, I'm going to talk about several of the research design tasks from my book with Alex George. I'm not going to talk about all of them because some of them are better addressed in some other videos in this series, but we're going to talk about how we come up with a good research question or puzzle, how we think about alternative explanations, make sure we haven't left out major explanations, and how we specify the variables. We're going to talk about case selection for both within case analysis, process tracing, and cross-case comparisons. In another video earlier in the series, I talked about concepts and measurements, so I won't address that here. I'll talk briefly about how we come up with structured questions to ask of each case, and then I'll conclude by summarizing 10 common challenges or flaws in case study research designs. So the first and most important task in research is coming up with a good question, a good puzzle, a good research problem. And if you've come up with a really good question, then that's going to be valuable, almost no matter what you do with the rest of the research, because it will get other people thinking and working and researching that topic as well. So there are different ways we might frame research questions. Often in political science, we ask how questions. Through what mechanisms or processes did the outcome arise? Or we can ask why questions. Why do these units or cases have these outcomes and these other units have a different outcome, even though they're similar in other ways? That's often a powerful way to frame a research question. And we want to be able to address what we call in political science the so what questions. So what have we learned from your research that we didn't already know? And what are the implications of your research for policy? What should we do differently moving forward? And we could ask similar questions in other fields. In business or in environmental studies, we're also interested in what we've learned that's new and how that might change our behavior going forward. Now, how do we come up with a good question or puzzle? And how do we know it when we see it? Well, one way to start is on what I call the demand side. We can try to look at the existing research and figure out, given what we already know, what's already been studied, what's the next most interesting question that we can ask. What are the limits to our current knowledge? What are the cases that would be interesting relative to what we already know? And here, it's never been easier in human history to find out what research has been done on any topic. Let me just show you quickly some features of Google Scholar that you may not be familiar with that are extremely useful here. So if we go to Google Scholar and we put in a search term, let's say international organizations, that's a very big topic. I can go up to these three horizontal bars in the left corner here and I can go to advanced search, and this gives me a much more powerful search engine. Now I can specify the exact phrase or one of the words. I can say whether they're anywhere in the article or in the title, if I sort of vaguely remember the title of an article. I can search on a specific author. That's very useful. And here's perhaps the most useful of all. I can specify the journal. So this journal, International Organization, publishes a lot on international organizations. So here, if we do that, this article here, Michael Barnett and Marty Finnemore, it's a well-known article. It's been cited over 2,500 times, right? So that step of specifying the journal, if you know what journal publishes on the general topic that you're interested in, that can really narrow your search to at least the start of your search. You may branch out to other journals after that. So the other key important feature here is I can go to the cited by. These are all the 2,500 other pieces of research that cite this particular article. I'll click on that. And now I can add another search term. So if I hit this box, I can say, of those 2,500 articles, how many also mention the International Monetary Fund? And now there's 972 of those. Or I could put in the IMF and let's say Thailand, right? And now there will be 169 of those, right? So it's very powerful to be able to add a second search term to all the things that cited the article that's interesting to you. Now, the other thing to note here is that Google Scholar typically returns the most cited pieces first at the top, but that also tends to be the older literature because if something is around longer, it gets more citations. So if you want to see the recent stuff, you might limit the search to everything since 2016, and now we go down to 55 instead of 169 articles, right? So those key features right there will give you a much more powerful search capacity, and you can quickly get your arms around any literature until you start to see the stuff that's cited is stuff that was already on your list or cited by the things on your list, and then you know you've got your arms around the literature. But you also have to look at other fields and different terms that they use for similar topics, and ask your committee what are the good search terms that we might use for this problem, because those can change over time as the literature evolves. So that's a good way to get your arms around the demand side of what's already been done, and then you can locate or situate your research question within that existing literature. You can also ask what are the key current policy challenges in cases that constitute those challenges, or you can ask what's the best historical analogy to this current policy challenge. We'll talk about that a lot more when we talk about typological theorizing in another video. Typologies are a way to classify what cases are similar in what respects with regard to what theories and variables. We can also ask, what does the literature most need? Does it need new theories? Does it for new or unexplained phenomena? Does it need to test existing theories against each other? Does it need to clarify the scope conditions of theories, under what conditions they actually operate? So let me give you an example here of a research program that unfolded in a very interesting way, where a lot of scholars at each stage came to similar conclusions about what was the next most interesting research question. And this is the example of research on what we call the democratic peace, or the interdemocratic peace, the idea that democracies haven't fought wars against other democracies. So if you trace the history of this idea, it goes back at least to Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, who argued that republics, or what we now call democracies, would be generally more peaceful than other kinds of government. Now we know actually that democracies aren't particularly peaceful. They fight lots of wars. They just don't fight them with other democracies. But the way we came to that conclusion is a couple hundred years after Immanuel Kant, where a guy named Dean Bapst, who was not an international relations specialist or even a political scientist, he was a sociologist, and he worked for the New York Bureau of Narcotics Addiction Control. But he was a kind of a weekend warrior of political science, and he wrote up a piece in a not very prominent journal, the Wisconsin Sociologist, not the American Sociological Review or International Organization, but in the Wisconsin Sociologist. He wrote up this argument that democracies don't fight wars against other democracies. And then he later published that. The first one was 1964. He did a second piece in 1972 in the journal Industrial Research, again, not a prominent social science journal. But somehow, even in the days before Google Scholar, another scholar named J. David Singer came across Dean Bapst's argument. I have no idea how he found it, but he then took up the question of whether democracies are generally more peaceful, and he found that the answer is probably not. J. David Singer was one of the first people to try to apply statistical analysis to international relations, so he was creating all these big data sets, and it quickly became apparent that, yes, democracies have fought plenty of wars, and we can think of many examples ourselves. But he didn't take up what proved in retrospect to be the more interesting question, which is, do democracies fight wars against other democracies? Later, another scholar, Michael Doyle, took up that question and wrote up an article in the American Political Science Review, very prominent journal, and argued that it looks like, just using some simple tests and statistics, it looks like democracies don't fight wars against other democracies. Now, suddenly, that's a very bold claim, and a lot of people got interested in that, and most of them thought this was just an accidental result, that if you used more sophisticated statistics and you threw in a lot of different control variables, that it would just disappear. Democracy is relatively rare in human history. Wars are relatively rare between any two particular states. So it would only take a few wars between democracies to say that they fight democracies at the same rate or same percentage that they fight non-democracies. Well, what happened was that as a lot of people started to apply different statistical models to that and different specifications and theories, it was a pretty robust result. It held up very well. And so a lot of people that were initially very skeptical came away convinced there's something going on here. There's a real phenomenon. It's not just an accidental correlation. Immediately then, a lot of people came to the similar conclusions about what's the next most interesting question to study, and that is why? Why don't democracies fight wars with other democracies? And so a lot of people started studying that. As they studied that, they turned to case studies because they're more interested in questions of mechanisms. They also studied a lot of other related questions that suddenly piqued their interest. Do democracies fight civil wars? Yes, they do. We can think of lots of examples. Do democracies trade at different rates with other democracies? Yes, they tend to trade more with other democracies. Do they make alliances with the other democracies more than they do with non-democracies? Yes, they do. So there's a whole set of other questions that then emerged that were very interesting and that we now have some strong empirical research on. I'll come back to some of the answers people have given to the why question when I come back to this as an example when we talk about multi-method research. But let me put that to the side for now. The point is that this was a program that evolved in a way that a lot of people understood at the same time. Given what we already know and have studied, here are some other next interesting questions. It's not always that clear. You'll find review articles where scholars propose, here are what I think are the most interesting next researchable questions in our field or our subfield. So things like annual political science reviews is a very good source for getting other people's view of the state of current knowledge and what we need to know next. Okay, we can also start with the supply side. Start with what we think are interesting cases, however we define interesting cases. So we might look for cases that defy our predictions, that don't have the outcome that we expected or that theorists or scholars or policymakers predicted. We might call these deviant cases or outlier cases. These are intrinsically interesting cases. We might ask what theories might apply to these cases that might explain their outcomes. A lot of times a student comes to me and says, I'm interested in this case. Maybe it's because they worked on it in government or it related to their family history or whatever. And I'll say, well, here's some interesting theories we could apply to that case, or here's some interesting questions we could ask of that case. And then they'll go off and think about it for a while and come back a few weeks later and they'll say, now I'm really interested in this question. This case I started with is one example of that, but here are some others. And now let's talk about, maybe some of these other cases that I might include in my research. So you can start either way, with questions that are interesting and then go to the cases, or cases that are interesting and then go to what are the questions we might ask of them. We can ask what theories might this case test or develop. We can ask also what are some information sources that haven't yet been exploited. There might be some archives that are just newly open. There might be some people who've just left government and they might be more willing to give interviews, or whatever the information sources are. New information sources are an interesting supply for insights about social life. We also have to ask, what's the goal of the research? Are we trying to identify new theories about causal mechanisms? If that's the goal, then we might emphasize the deviant or outlier cases. Are we trying to test established theories? Then we'll look for cases where two competing theories make mutually exclusive predictions about either the outcome or the processes that led to the outcome. We might, if we're going to do a big, expensive study, a multi-country study with lots of funds and lots of time, we might do a quick, inexpensive pilot study to test out our ideas and to maybe change or develop the way we're going to measure the variables or so on. We might try to refine the scope conditions of a theory by finding the most likely case that it fails to explain or the least likely case that it succeeds in explaining, to find the upper and lower bounds of its scope conditions. We might examine a new phenomena. The COVID pandemic is not entirely new. We've had other pandemics, but it's unique in some respects. It occurs in an environment of social media. It occurs, it has a certain way that it's propagated. We've had other pandemics that got started, SARS, MERS, and so on. We could also study a subtype of phenomena. Maybe we want to study respiratory pandemics that are spread by air spread rather than some other mechanism, right? So whatever research question we ask, it should satisfy two tests. One is the informed scholar test. If an informed scholar asks you, what are you researching, and you tell them this is my question, they should light up. They should get interested. They should start asking you a bunch of questions. They should point you to some other research that's useful but not exactly on your topic. And you should see that response. You want to see that excited response, that this is really new and worth doing. The other test is what I call the taxi driver test. Taxi drivers are smart, they just don't have a lot of time and they don't have a lot of patience for nonsense. So if you can't explain your puzzle to a taxi driver in a way that interests them, then you've got a challenge on your hands. I picked up a taxi once outside the gates of my university, Georgetown, and the driver was reading Steve Walt's Origins of Alliances, which is a book that we used in our graduate program. And he was from the Middle East, and the book is about case studies in the Middle East. And he just wanted to read a book, by a high-level political scientist who was researching that question. So if you can't explain your puzzle in a way that excites both, professional scholars and smart but not people who are not in your profession, then you've got a challenge. It's a little bit like, when you pitch a movie idea to a producer, you have to have the elevator pitch that you can explain quickly why it's interesting. You have to have a longer pitch for fundraising, and then eventually you have to have the movie itself that will be of interest to a wide audience, right? Okay, two additional criteria for a good puzzle that should be obvious, but people don't always follow them. One is it should be something that's actually researchable, that you could actually get access to evidence that would be interesting and powerful and shed light on the alternative explanations. If it's not researchable, then you don't want to frustrate yourself by trying to research it. And the second one is this a question that we don't already have a very good, strong answer to? Or if we do have a good, strong answer to, is there some reasonable chance that I might show that answer is wrong or incomplete? If you already know the answer, then what's the point of research, right? It should be something that no matter what answer you come to after your research, your answer is going to be interesting. Even if your answer is only reaffirming the conventional wisdom, maybe you do that in a convincing, compelling way. Even more interesting, perhaps you're able to overthrow or change the conventional wisdom, right? But it should be something that no matter what answer you come to, it will be interesting, right? Okay, so as an exercise for those of you who are taking a course with me, or even if you're not, you want to try this out just for your own learning, I'd like you to identify 4 or 5 interesting questions or puzzles that relate to the politics or economics or sociology of the COVID pandemic, either the effects of the pandemic or the ways that different individuals, organizations, governments have responded to the pandemic. I've given you a few useful web links here that give some country-by-country data or some other kinds of evidence. You can, of course, use any information you can find, whether it's on the web or elsewhere. You can put, if you find some interesting sources that relate to the puzzles or questions you come up with, you could add those links to the Google Doc as well. So take some time before you go on to the next video, whether you're working alone or in a group, and think through what would be some interesting puzzles or questions to ask about the COVID pandemic.